Hey everyone, hope you're all feeling nice and full and not too hot after lunch today. I am joined by Rich Troughton, the famous Rich, if you don't know him already. And he's also playing the role of John Wool, who unfortunately isn't going to be able to make it today. But keep him in your thoughts, please. So you're going to get a 2-for-1, which is a great deal. Love deals. And Rich is going to be presenting Running Jamf Pro at Scale from SAP with Love. So please give a big hand for Rich.
So just so everyone can keep track of when it's going to be me talking, when it's going to be John talking, I brought this convenient hat. So when the hat's on, it's John. Also, I'm wearing, I don't know if any of you were at JNUC 2019 or remember these hoodies. They were handing them out for JNUC 2020 in San Diego, so I'm wearing it in honor of the fact that we finally made it to San Diego. So, as mentioned, my name is Rich Troughton, and I'm happy to be here today to discuss this topic with my teammate in spirit, John Wool. Before we get started, there's something I'd like to mention, that is to please hold all questions until the end. If you've got questions, make a note of them and then hit me at the end of the talk. With luck, I'll be able to answer most of your questions during the talk itself. So, my colleague John and I had planned to break up the topic of scaling a bit as we have 2 separate Jamf Pro instances set up, one for macOS and another for iOS, and each of them have their own scaling challenges, so we're each going to talk about our own experiences. So, first off, the view from macOS at SAP. So this discussion is all about running Jamf Pro at scale, right? So what's that mean? Well, in summary, it's all about the number of devices that you're managing. So there are things that you can ask Jamf Pro to do when you're managing 300 devices that you absolutely positively should not try to do when you're managing 30,000. Yeah. A lot of today's discussion is going to come down to these 4 topics. You've got infrastructure, keeping your database as small as possible, how you're handling API usage, and making sure that you're doing the minimum you need to, but you're maximizing the return for the actions that you're taking. So let's take a look at infrastructure first. Now, this is going to be for on-premise installations. For Jamf Cloud, scaling up your infrastructure usually just really involves throwing more money at Jamf, and then they handle all the fiddly bits for you. Also, when you are looking at infrastructure, please, please, please use Jamf Pro's ability to cluster. That will allow you to spread that workload and reduce the risk of having a single point of failure. The infrastructure guidance I will be discussing assumes a clustered Jamf Pro setup. So for memory, the more you can throw at Java, the better off you're going to be. So my rule of thumb was to get the minimum memory for the OS, quadruple that, and then allocate all your other memory to Java. Quadrupling the minimum for the OS provided, that should give you sufficient buffer for the OS to do what it needs to while Java basically eats the rest. So in this case, my assumption is that the only thing that's running on this particular host is going to be Java, Jamf Pro's Tomcat software, which would use Java's allocation of memory, and of course the operating system. So by the end of my shop's hosting of Jamf Pro ourselves, we were hosting it in Amazon Web Services, and we were using R4 2x large instances. And those come with 61 gigabytes of RAM. So following my rule of thumb, I gave the OS 8 gigabytes of RAM, and I gave Java the remaining 53. So this ran fine for our setup, and there were no performance issues. So to give Java its memory allocation, I set the XMX value in Tomcat setm script to 53 gigabytes, although, as you can see, I did some calculations to use megabytes instead. I expressed this in megabytes because I hadn't discovered yet that you could, in fact, just express gigabytes using a capital G for the letter value where I have M. So I unnecessarily did some math, learned from my mistakes. The reason I took this approach was so that I could ensure that Java's memory allocation had a set ceiling and ensure that there would be a chunk of memory that Java could not take, and that would be memory that the OS could use. So for processors, again, the more you can throw at Java, the better off you're going to be. So Java is a multi-threaded language, which means it can split up work and run tasks in parallel. The more processors you can give it, the more tasks it can run simultaneously. So why does having multiple processor cores matter for a multi-threaded Java application? Well, here's an analogy. Imagine you have to eat constantly, and your threads are your hands, and your cores are your mouth. The work being done by the processors is eating the food. So if you have multiple hands, you can quickly bring a lot of food to your mouth. But if you have just one mouth, you're going to be bottlenecked by how much food you can fit into your mouth at any one time. So the solution is to add more mouths. That way, food is hopefully being consumed by a mouth as fast as a hand can bring it. So needless to say, there's a lot of performance tuning you can do here to find the ideal configuration. I can say that we had 2 internet-facing cluster nodes with 8 processors in 2019, and they handled our client base of 25,000 managed Macs without an issue. Now, for those interested in Jamf Pro performance tuning on-premise, I have a post that I wrote in 2016 for performance tuning for Jamf Pro's Tomcat, which is available via the link in the screen. Of course, if you're in Jamf Cloud, what you need to do is talk to your finance people and arrange to simply throw more money at Jamf, and that will handle your performance tuning. So to follow along on allocating a lot of memory and processors, when you think of scaling, I recommend using the idea of scaling up individual Jamf Pro cluster nodes with more processors and more memory. Now, this is in place of scaling out, where you have more instances, but they have fewer processors and less memory. So the reason is that because Java runs better when it has more memory and more processors, adding those resources to individual cluster nodes will get you better performance overall than if you try to spread the workload across multiple instances, which have individually less power. So my last point on infrastructure is trying to figure out exactly how many resources to allocate to Jamf Pro is going to be hard. There's a lot of factors in play, especially if you're dealing with a rapidly growing population of managed Macs. So my recommendation for this is basically overestimate what you need. Build a setup that uses what may seem to you to be crazy amounts of processor power and memory. This especially applies if you're using virtualization to host your Jamf Pro servers, as you can, if you're like, I'm using too much, you can always ramp that back really easily. So let's look at the Jamf Pro database next. The more data you gather, and the more your database grows, the harder Jamf Pro is having to work to find the data it needs to do its job. So the smaller the Jamf Pro database is, the better performance you are going to get from Jamf Pro. This is going to apply to both Jamf Cloud and if you're hosting yourself. So an example of something which is on by default, which you may not actually need, is gathering application usage data. So this is data that's constantly changing on the managed Mac, and Jamf Pro is storing it in your database. Do you need this data, though? Are you referring to it, or are you using it in any way? If the honest answer is no, turn it off. That change by itself will go a long way towards slimming down a large database. Another example, which is on by default, is gathering active services data. This is, again, data that's constantly changing on your managed Mac. Jamf Pro is storing that in the database. Apply the same test as you do for application usage. Are you using this data? Is this something you're referencing? If the answer is no, don't gather it. Turn this off. It may seem counterintuitive to deliberately gather less information, but paring down what you're gathering to what you actually need will help keep Jamf Pro running smoothly as you add more and more Macs to it for you to manage. Now, another area to look at is what's being reported by your extension attributes. So these run on every device every time you run an inventory update, and then they post information to the database. So one way to save space in the database is to use binary code to indicate a status, where 1 indicates something is there, and 0 indicates all other conditions. So for example, I have an extension attribute that checks for a T2 chip. It's there, or it's not. So I use 1 to indicate that it's there, and 0 for all the other conditions. So using this method means that only 1 character is being stored as the result either way, which means that the bare minimum space is being used in the database. So another place where you can save space in the database is the logs. So Jamf Pro will store its logs in the database, so the more logs are stored there, that bigger the database is going to be. So that's what we don't want. So let's move those logs elsewhere. So when my shop self-hosted our Jamf Pro instance in Amazon Web Services, we used Amazon's EC2 service to host the Tomcat instances and the RDS service to host the database. So both services were configured to send their logging to another service, which was Amazon's CloudWatch service. Logs were streamed continuously to CloudWatch, so I was able to get a live look at my Jamf Pro logs without needing to interact with the instances in any way. I also used CloudWatch's filters to do log analysis and to set alarms to notify me if certain desired or undesired events were happening. And frankly, this saved me from myself a few times when I thought a Jamf Pro upgrade had frozen, because I could look at the MySQL logs, specifically the long query logs, slow query, long query, slow query. I was able to access the logs through CloudWatch, and I was able to see that there were long-running queries happening in the database. So it was going, just slow. Not everyone has access to CloudWatch, though, but there are other ways to send your logs elsewhere. A good example is the Jamf Pro add-on for Splunk, which uses the API to retrieve logging information, then send it on to a Splunk logging server. And if you are able to ship your logs elsewhere, then you don't need to hang on to them in the database. Keep the bare minimum and leverage Jamf Pro's log flushing to get rid of older logs. Now, one important thing to know about this is that Jamf Pro is always going to retain the latest log it has for something. Even if the log in question should be flushed, it won't be as long as it's the latest event. Now, an important exception for this is if you turned off information gathering on something. So for example, if you turn off application usage logging, that will age out of the database and get flushed because you've told Jamf Pro, I don't want this anymore, thus it's not going to hang on to it. So assuming that your logs are going elsewhere, what is my recommendation for the log flushing? 1 week's worth of logs. If I could go lower, I would. But 1 week is currently the lowest retention setting in Jamf Pro that you can get right now. So all this will keep your database as small as possible, which will help keep it running smoothly. It also might make for faster upgrades for you. So let's turn our attention next to API usage, because as you scale up with Jamf Pro, the more you're likely to get groups outside of your team who will want to access the data stored in Jamf Pro. So some best practices when scaling have been documented by Jamf. And one important thing to know is that neither API used by Jamf Pro include a server-side mechanism for rate limiting. So it's important that you're handling this in the application that is sending your API calls. And Jamf also recommends having no more than 5 concurrent connections. Now, Jamf also recommends that if your API using application is requesting data more than once daily, please consider using webhooks. Now, this will allow Jamf Pro to notify your application in real time when changes occur. Now, the webhook data is not going to have all the information usually provided by an API call, so one way to get around that might be when you receive the webhook, send out an API call to gather the remaining information that you need if what you need is not in that webhook. Now, for those not familiar with API rate limiting, it's the idea that you deliberately limit how many API commands you're sending within a defined period of time. So in light of Jamf's recommendation that you have no more than 5 concurrent connections, limiting how many commands you send at once is a good idea. And I'm going to illustrate why this is a good idea with the story of when it wasn't used. So a few years back, we got a request from a group that wanted to use the compliance data we have gathered in Jamf Pro to help govern whether or not a particular Mac could be allowed access to our network or not. They were starting out with a pilot project of limited scope. I read over the project's approved security paperwork, and all appeared to be in order. So I was like, all right, I'll add your service account. And then I assigned the account the least privileged access required. So far, so good. So about a month later, I take a business trip to Germany. This is to see my teammates in Berlin and to also meet with some Jamf folks about this new iOS management service that we're planning to stand up using Jamf Pro. So while I'm in a meeting with the Jamf folks, I get an urgent message from my teammates. Our Jamf Pro server isn't responding. Or rather, the admin console was responsive, but managed Macs couldn't check in, and self-service wasn't working. Now, one thing that is important to know for this story is that our admin console was not exposed to the internet, and it had a different DNS address than the DNS address used to send API commands and for the clients to check in with. So the meeting to discuss our new iOS service now turns into a meeting about what the heck is going on. So we pull the logs, and we see that our internet-facing Jamf Pro cluster nodes are getting absolutely hammered with traffic. So we're a big company, and thus we're a target. So we start looking for somebody like this. But as we dig and we dig, we're not seeing any suspicious traffic. All of this seems to be coming from legit SAP IP addresses. And they're also all over the place, so there isn't one specific place that all this traffic is coming from. It's like a whole bunch of offices suddenly quintupled or more the amount of traffic they're sending to Jamf Pro. So we spend the whole day working on this, and then around quitting time, the problem goes away, disappears, poof. What? So we check in with our colleagues in the Americas. Keep in mind, I'm in Germany at the time. Problem's gone for them. Messed up their morning, but everything looks fine now, and they keep on trucking through the afternoon. Check in with our APJ folks in Asia and Australia. Problem's gone for them, too. Super weird. Hope that doesn't happen again. The sun rises on a new working day in Europe. And it's back. Exact same thing, where a whole bunch of SAP offices are sending us an insane amount of traffic. But this time, we're looking to see if there's a common factor. All the crazy traffic is connecting using one service account, the service account of the pilot project that I mentioned earlier in the story. So that service account's access is promptly pulled. And then we set up a meeting with that group to find out what? So what had happened is that the other group had embraced a very broad understanding of pilot project. So from the security paperwork that I had seen, it appeared that there would be one source for API calls, and this was incorrect. Instead, every office location would be having an appliance that would be sending API calls to our Jamf Pro server. We have a lot of offices in Europe. This appliance would be sending two API calls for each online computer in that office. So the pilot part of the project was rolling it out to Europe first. That seems to be a bit more than a pilot to me, but so that explained why the problem went away when the European workday ended, because everyone shut down their stuff and went home. So when we ran the math, the current configuration was sending us 250,000 API calls a second. Even more fun, we learned in the meeting that the office appliances, in the event that they could not contact the Jamf Pro server, would save the API calls they couldn't send. And you know what they did with those saved API calls? When they saw Jamf Pro again, they sent them, in addition to any new ones they were making. So basically, right as we came back online, wham, we're back down again. This is why setting rate limits for API is so important, especially when dealing with a project like the one I just described, where multiple independent sources are sending API calls. Without setting limits on how many API calls are sent and thus received, you may find yourself, like me, suffering an accidental denial of service attack. And with that, I am yielding the floor to my teammate John to talk about iOS. So hi, I'm John Wool, and I'm the technical lead for the iOS Jamf infrastructure and cloud instances here at SAP. I am super excited to share with you a few of the challenges, successes, and things that I've learned while here at SAP. So I originally joined the SAP umbrella from Concur. SAP acquired us, and I joined the family. And I was the Jamf lead there, managing around 1,800 Macs and about 15 to 20 iPads. So this picture very accurately describes how I felt when I joined the team. I say this because coming on to a well-known team was a bit intimidating. So coming on to the greater Apple at SAP team, I was given the responsibility of managing the iOS Jamf Pro instances, which to me was an exciting and definitely different opportunity. I wasn't really the cool kid, but I was happy to be associated with the popular group now. So what I'll be discussing today is the following. The first is the current state of the iOS population here at SAP, how we leverage our own application development team, the importance of the working relationship between different external technical teams, and how important it is to stay in close contact with your internal service desk to maintain that user-centric service. So back to this slide that Rich shared earlier. I'm going to reiterate this, but with a different number. As of now, at SAP, we have about 90,000 actively used iOS devices on a global scale. Now, granted, managing iOS isn't quite the same as managing macOS, so don't compare the numbers, but instead compare the load on the Jamf Pro server. Coming from managing just 15 to 20 iPads at Concur This continually blows my mind that we're at this number. So with an inventory update happening every 24 hours per device, that means that there are 3,750 inventory updates taking place every hour, which would mean that there are 62.5 inventory updates every minute. And that basically boils down to an inventory update from an iOS device hitting Jamf Pro every second. So that doesn't factor in application installs, configuration profile installs, and all the other MDM communication associated with that. So that being said, when we make or schedule changes that affect all devices, we plan that it will take at least 2 to 3 days for the change to be completed to all devices. Now, currently, we span all time zones. We follow the sun. So we need to be able to make changes that won't adversely affect anyone in the world. As you can imagine, that's a challenge. So when deploying to devices within SAP, there are a few configuration profiles that all devices are going to need to remain compliant, maintain access to all company resources, and also utilize our single sign-on for authentication. So that distribute to all button is not taken lightly. So we make sure to test any major change in our environment. I recommend that if you have a Jamf Cloud instance, that you either create an identical Jamf Pro test server as close as possible to production, or create another Jamf Cloud test instance with all identical profiles and configurations. So this is a lifesaver in terms of any change that could cause any unforeseen circumstances. You'll find this out in test before it ever affects your users. You might have a bad day in test, but that beats a bad day in production any day. No matter how large or small your device population is, this is something that is critical to put into place in order to ensure smooth operational changes. So currently we use only one instance for all different workflows for our iOS devices. SAP Events devices, Visitor iPads, IT Service Desk iPads, all the others. This is in addition to the general population of all the iOS devices that are within SAP. All these are being managed under our one single Jamf Pro instance, which allows them to rule them all. Now, on to a few ways of how we leverage in-house applications at SAP. We work very closely with what we call the apps team at SAP, and that gives us a great advantage at how we can utilize all sorts of technology in order to provide a great experience to our users. So when I joined the team, we were about to migrate all of our iOS devices from another MDM product to Jamf Cloud, and we did so successfully, but that meant managing a population of about 60,000 iOS devices at the time, all in Jamf Cloud. So for both me and Rich, this was a bit of unexplored territory and also a bit daunting. But with the help of our in-house developed Apple at SAP application, that made it a lot easier for users to manage the migration on their own. So another way we were able to leverage our Apple at SAP app, in addition to the migration process I just talked about, was to make Azure registration with device compliance a more personable and seamless process. Now, before enrollment, the users are given instructions on how to register their device with Azure via self-service, or the way we prefer, with our in-house Apple at SAP app. So shout out to my colleague Philip Pinkernell for developing the Apple at SAP app and this additional functionality. After registration, device compliance is in place, and it'll allow the user to access all the related Microsoft resources. So here's a demo of how it looks today. So here is a enrolled iOS device. And first thing we're going to pull up is our Apple at SAP app, which does a number of things. And we're going to use that to run us through our device compliance enrollment. So we're going to go ahead and start registration. And at that point, it tells us, hey, I want to open Authenticator. So at that point, it opens Microsoft Authenticator. And at this point, we're using Authenticator's own built-in native stuff to do the sign-in. Now Authenticator wants to open Apple SAP to send it back to that direction. Apple SAP says, all right, let's get self-service opened. Self-service wants to launch Authenticator. We're back to Authenticator. But from the user's perspective, they're just having to hit the button to open the app and sign in. And then we go to register. And now we're registered with Microsoft, which is great. And the user really didn't have to do much. They just had to hit open and sign in when prompted. And now, we're all set to go. Are we, John? You need to do anything else in this demo?
Take the hat off.
Oh, that's right. I don't want to be talking to myself. That'd look crazy. Yeah, we're good, Rich. So now let's talk about relationships. You thought this was just to talk about Jamf stuff, right? Well, sorry. Most of what we do is about how well we work with others, isn't it? Or a lot of it is. Working with the Jamf Cloud instance, I suddenly found myself in less control. Ultimately, less control means less worry, right? Not quite. Now, I don't really have to worry about how well our multi-node cluster is working. I don't have to worry about CPU usage. I don't have to worry about RAM. Or I don't have to worry about how well the database is doing. That is all handled by the awesome support folks over at Jamf. But I do need to be on the lookout for what sort of funny things we find within our environment and within the product itself. So the partnership between SAP and Jamf has been awesome in that we have become their partners in making their Jamf product better at the kind of scale we're running at. So after working closely with Jamf for a few years, we've had the pleasure of finding issues that do come up when you're on a large scale. Once again, stuff you don't find with 300 devices that you find with 90,000. Now, for example, one of the greatest wins for the iOS at SAP team, Jamf and Microsoft started with something that I mentioned before. We were doing device compliance. So when we first rolled out device compliance to production, we were finding that Azure registrations would not get the coveted green check mark to show up. They would just sit there as non-compliant for many hours. Big deal, right? Well, that meant that users thought they were registered, but they wouldn't receive any access to any of their Microsoft resources, and most importantly, no email. People tend to notice when they don't have their email. And after many meetings between Microsoft, Jamf, and SAP, we were able to find out the reason why this was happening. Not all users within a company are granted an Intune license. And this meant that as Azure was processing batches of device registrations, as soon as an account that didn't have a license was found, the whole batch would fail. Didn't matter how far you got. Didn't matter if it was like, you're on batch of 100 and it was 99. Whole thing failed. Sure enough, after the developer at Microsoft was able to change the batch processing method, we were seeing the green check mark after a minute or two. Win. Now, Jamf support was very helpful in this process by providing all the necessary logs and also facilitating most of the meetings between Microsoft support, ourselves, and Jamf support to ensure that a solution was found quickly to this problem. So this was just one victory over the many victories that we've experienced while working with Jamf and other partners. So this also underscores the importance of, while working at scale, it is so important to develop those amazing working relationships because they really do help you to be better together. These types of relationships also ultimately help Jamf continue to be the leader in the MDM space. So last topic I'm going to be going over is to stress the importance of communicating with your IT service folks, because they're going to be seeing problems before we do. So in order to be proactive and foster a learning environment for our users, we need to make sure that we're on top of any and all issues that may affect our users. So instead of brushing things off like Morpheus here, we take any issue seriously to make sure that it doesn't affect a greater population of devices. Typically, if we see one issue, we assume that it's affecting at least 1,000 people. And with this mindset, we're able to communicate quickly and effectively with our service desk. Because after all, if it turns out not to be affecting 1,000 users, hey, pleasant surprise. So to accomplish this, we have weekly open invitation meetings to anyone who wants to attend to get an overview of what we're currently seeing and how to resolve the issues that we're seeing. So it also gives all the technicians involved an opportunity to raise any new issues that may have been found recently, because there might be one office that is just having this one weird problem that nobody else is having, and this is the first we're hearing about it. But because that tech is in that meeting, we know about it now. So this meeting also serves as the go-to place for all service desk folks to keep apprised of all possible iOS issues and how to resolve them at the front line, because after all, that's where you want them resolved. It takes the least time, and it also makes sure that the load is being spread across the widest base of people, as opposed to everything getting funneled up to us. So Here's the lessons we've learned over the years for both the macOS and the iOS side. First of all, rate limiting is good, folks. Real good. Use it. A smaller database is a happier database. Seek innovation from within your company. And also, please make sure to work closely with your support folks to resolve your problems. And with that, thank you very much. How are we doing on time? Do we have some time for some questions?
Question for John.
Oh, question for John. Hang on.
I'm coming.
All right, shoot. Oh, no. All right. Is the question for John or for Rich? Oh, sorry. Is it for...
His question was, what's it like working with Rich?
All right.
Well, my question was, you talked about rate limiting API calls and how you can't do that on the server side. So how do you do it?
This is something that I've learned to work closely with the folks who want to get API access into our machines. The first thing I always ask now, well, the first thing I've been asking for a while has been, can I see your approved security paperwork? Because there is a long and extensive process that security makes people go through for their projects. And if they don't have that, then I tell them that they need that. But now I'm also asking them, if you need API access, let's talk about rate limiting, and then I tell them that story. And some people are like, I don't see why that applies to me. And I tell them, well, it's going to apply to you. In general, I'll get outside groups that are like, well, we're going to be sending like one set of calls at like midnight Central European time. It's going to be like maybe 5 calls. Is that okay? I'm like, sounds good to me. Then we have the group that who is the subject of the story that keeps coming back every year or so, and I'm like, did you change anything? And they say no, and I said, then go away, because I'm not dealing with that again. Yes?
I think you mentioned when you were hosted in AWS that it was easy for you to get your logs into another, cloud?
So it was CloudWatch, yes.
What's your thoughts, just off the top of your head, if none of your we only have an S3 bucket in AWS.
Right.
Everything else is on-prem. Just off the top of your head, what kind of a nightmare do you think it is to get some logs into?
Well, that's going to depend. I mean, like I also mentioned that if you're using Splunk, there is the Jamf Pro add-on for Splunk, where Splunk can talk to that. That's going to be a good question. I mean, in AWS, it just made it easy because they had, set these roles, set these permissions, and boom, it all goes off to CloudWatch. If you're hosting on-premise, you've got your various pieces set up, so you'd have to configure, like, for example, your Tomcat instance to send its logs to syslog. You would have to configure your MySQL database server, assuming it's separate, to send its logs to syslog, and then you could have Splunk or another solution crunch the logs and get kind of the same functionality that I did with CloudWatch. Yeah, there's ways around it,
Over here.
Yes.
So you said you have an open call with your service desk and other folks that are doing support. I assume that's probably quite a few people that join. What approaches have you gotten or used that you found effective to actually get them to ask questions, particularly in a large conference call like that, where people might be shy or they might not want to ask the silly question?
Well, one way we do this is do it in Teams and then post your questions to the Teams chat. So, and then someone gets the questions out of there and is like, we got these accumulated questions, and let's go over them. So that's one way to avoid having the conference call where everybody's talking over everybody else, is leverage text. Do this in Teams, do this in Slack, do this in Zoom, leverage the chat, and put your questions there.
Hi. You mentioned using more processors, like instead of having a multitude of servers, less servers, but more prosecuting.
Yeah.
Not prosecuting. Processors and RAM, right? So
Right.
you're saying just build a more robust VM instead of having multiple.
Yeah, instead of doing a horizontal scaling, vertical scaling. So have a Tomcat instance that has like, I think I had 8 processor cores and 61 gigs of RAM. Because I tried the other way first, where I was like, okay, I'll set up a bunch of 2 processor core, 4 gig instances, and I'll just set up a bunch of them. And I had terrible performance. So unfortunately, this isn't, that works well for something like if you're doing web hosting where you've got something that's fairly static or something that's not that processor intensive, and it's more important that you just want to make sure that something is there to get it. The way Java works, it just makes more sense to go up rather than out.
Okay, thank you. Because mine is wide, and I want to do that. Thank you.
Rich, quick question on the rate limiting side of things, again on the API. What were your thoughts when you were thinking about maybe funneling everyone through like an API gateway so that you could have a central choke point for that?
We had thought about that. The issue for us was now we had a different address than everything else, and for us it was just more complexity. So we did think about that. But honestly, the right answer, because I can't think of a single scaling way that I could have set it up that could have dealt with 250,000 API calls a second. It just, it's the best answer is, from my point of view, to limit what's getting sent out. Because unfortunately, there just isn't. You could set up an API gateway, but that's just kind of, in my opinion, moving the problem off to the side. You're not really solving the problem. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But the other right answer is make sure people just aren't trying to overwhelm you in the first place. Any other questions? Questions for John?
Are you off of legacy API already, or are you making the transition?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
Legacy API, are you already moved off, or are you currently working with those other
Oh, I
departments?
see. You're asking about the authentication change that we're seeing? Okay. That is a work in transition. So most of our stuff is, yes, we've moved it. We got most of our systems moved over. We still have some systems that for various reasons are just being slower to do so, and we're telling them, your stuff just might break someday. You really do need to handle this. Like, we have some outside teams that communicate via API, and we're like, we pretty much told them all, you need to have this fixed by August 1st. And after that point, it might just break on you unexpectedly. So for our own internal stuff, I think we still have one tool that's managed by our team that we're still working to get transitioned over. It's not mission critical. It would be a shame to have a break, but it's not mission critical. Everything else is handled. Anybody else? Any other questions? Thought we had one in the back for a second. But apparently not. All right, then I will wrap it up here. I thank you. John thanks you. And I hope you have a lovely JNUC.